Thank you, Godfeld. I hope I've pronounced that right. And thank you very much for inviting me. So the title of the talk that I was given was "Where Do Our Ideas Come From?" which of course is a massive theme and a rather intimidating one. And so rather than just plunging straight in, I thought that what I would do, I might talk about where my ideas come from. And that might seem a slightly egocentric, a slightly arrogant way to frame it, but it's not actually, I think, because the argument that I want to give tonight, as Daniel said, is that to live in the West is irrevocably to be affected by the cultural inheritance of Christianity. And if that is the case, then I too am an expression of that. And so I want to offer my own kind of appreciation of this notion as a kind of exemplar, because it's something that I've come to quite late in my life. And so in a sense, writing Dominion, the book in which I explore this theme, it's been like a kind of pilgrimage for me, but as I say, one that I've arrived at quite late in my life. So I was raised Christian. My mother is a devout member of the Church of England. So I went to church, I sang in the choir, I went to Sunday school. And I kind of believed it, and I was interested in the Bible, particularly the Old Testament. But the awful truth was that I had another love as a child, one that was much more intense, much deeper, and that was a love of dinosaurs. And I loved dinosaurs because they were big and they were fierce and they were glamorous. And the truth is that I found them a lot more glamorous than anything that I was getting in church. And that's why when I went to Sunday school, there was a children's illustrated book of Bible stories. And on the very first page, there was an illustration of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, surrounded by all the animals. So there was a snake, obviously. There were kind of tigers and peacocks and parrots and all kinds of things. And there was a brachiosaur. And this was a cause of great excitement to me, because obviously any book that had a dinosaur in it, I kind of loved it. But it was also a cause of puzzlement, because there were Adam and Eve and there was the dinosaur. And the one thing that I knew was that no human being had ever seen a brachiosaur. This was long before Jurassic Park. The very idea was impossible. So I asked the Sunday school teacher, what's going on here? And she couldn't really answer the question. And I'm sure you've all had the kind of experience when you were a child of discovering that not only do adults not know everything, but occasionally there are things that they don't know that you do. And so for the first time, a kind of faint shadow of doubt came over my my belief in what I was being told. And it was the realization that everything I was being told in church, everything that seemed so important, that actually not only was it less interesting than dinosaurs, but reading about dinosaurs might be opening up a way of understanding the world that Christianity seemed not to contain. It was something that came to me quite early. And it was then enhanced by the way in which my interest in dinosaurs moved seamlessly on to an interest in what I suppose in historical terms is the equivalent of dinosaurs, which was a fascination with the Roman Empire. And in fact, I have the very first book that got me gripped by this, I have with me. I've never left it, so I'm just going to hold it up now, and you can perhaps see it, I hope. What this illustrates is the Battle of Alesia, which was Julius Caesar's greatest victory when he conquered Gaul. And you can see there that it's a kind of very brutal and bloody affair. And you've got this this legionary here with a spear stuck in his body, and there's blood going everywhere. And that's the kind of thing that, being a horrible little boy, I loved in illustrations of dinosaurs. And now there it was in illustrations of the Roman army. And so I became kind of obsessed with the Romans in the way that I'd been obsessed with tyrannosaurs. They seemed to be the apex predator. And this merged actually with quite a lot that I was reading in the Bible, because of course there are a lot of predatory empires in the Bible. Assyrians, Egyptians, Babylonians, Greeks, and then of course in the New Testament, the Romans. And again, the awful truth is that I found the Romans a lot more interesting than I did, say, the disciples. And if you think about Jesus being brought before Pontius Pilate, my sympathies were entirely with Pontius Pilate, because he had all the glamour on his side. He had the toga, he had the purple, he had the eagles, he had the soldiers. Jesus didn't have any of that. He was just a kind of scruff. And on top of that, I found the gods worshipped by the Romans, and even more by the Greeks. I found them a lot more interesting than I found the Christian God. The Greek gods in particular were getting up to all kinds of shocking things. They were glamorous, they were sassy, they were charismatic, they were sexy. And so it wasn't so much that I had a kind of spectacular moment where I lost my faith. It was just that it was like a dimmer switch slowly going down to be replaced, or a bit like the moon being blotted out by the light of the sun. And the sun, in my imagination, was definitely the civilizations of Greece and of Rome. And so that's why over the course of my my teenage years into adulthood, that remained my great enthusiasm, my great obsession. And when I came to write history, it was to the Romans and then to the Greeks that I turned for my subject. And the very first book that I wrote was about the lifetime of Julius Caesar, the collapse of the Roman Republic, the emergence of the autocracy under Augustus. And so the Siege of Alesia, for instance, had a key role to play in that. But approaching it as an adult, of course, I was unable to do it with the naivety that I had had as a child, because I had to think through what the implications of the violence in the conquest of Gaul had been. If you've read Asterix, you might get the impression that the Romans conquered Gaul without actually killing anyone. The truth, of course, is a lot more brutal. Plutarch, who wrote a century or so after the lifetime of Julius Caesar, may have been exaggerating when he said that Caesar had slaughtered 1 million Gauls and enslaved a further 1 million, but probably not by much. And I've kind of found it shocking, not just that Caesar had done this, but also that he seemed to have had no moral qualms about it whatsoever. And that when in due course he came to celebrate his triumph, this great kind of procession through which he'd parade his greatness through the streets of Rome, he'd lead his captives in chains behind him, and placards would be carried detailing how many of the enemy had been slaughtered. And this was something that the Romans seemed positively to revel in. And there seemed a kind of innocent quality to their callousness. And it unsettled me. And the more that I wrote about the Greeks and the Romans, the more foreign they came to seem to me, the more alien, the more frightening. And it wasn't just in terms of their moral values. It was also the whole spectrum of what I felt made me what I was, my understanding of things like sexuality, family relationships, the understanding of words like secular or religion. All of these seemed to me to have been radically reconfigured by something that separated me from the world of Julius Caesar. And it bothered me more and more. I began to ask myself more and more, what is going on here? And a bit like when you have a kind of itch on your back and you're trying to scratch it, gradually I began to realize that the itch that I had to scratch was that what had happened, what had changed, was the coming of Christianity. And so for about 10, 12 years, I've been kind of looking at this tangentially, kind of approaching this idea from various angles. And then recently, when I came to write Dominion, the book that Daniel mentioned, the one that's just come out, I set myself to do this right the way through, to see, is this actually the case? Can I trace the way in which the classical world, the world that Christ was born into, can I trace the way in which it mutated over the course of the centuries in obedience to Christian assumptions, Christian teachings, Christian theology, culminating in the world that we all inhabit now? And it was a process that was sharpened for me by a further experience, one that was not dependent on reading books of ancient history or meditating on the Bible, but going to visit a scene that was actually served to transplant me back into the moral world that the Romans had inhabited. I was about, I should think, maybe 20,000 words into my book when I went to Iraq to make a film about the Islamic State. And this was in 2016. So the Islamic State was still very much on the scene. And we went to a town called Sinjar, which was on the front line with the Islamic State. It had been recaptured by the Kurds a few months before, but it was still very much within artillery range from the ISIS guns. So it was quite a nerve-wracking experience. And we wanted to visit it because Sinjar had been the home of a religious minority called the Yazidis. I'm sure lots of you will have heard of them, but for those of you who haven't, they were treated with particular cruelty, even by the standards of the Islamic State, because they were regarded erroneously by the Islamic State as devil worshippers. And so when ISIS captured Sinjar, they subjected the Yazidis to, the men were slaughtered, those who were captured, some were actually crucified, many of the women were killed, but those who were regarded as sufficiently attractive were taken into slavery, all the way down to girls of the age of 9. And so to visit this site where people had been, men had been crucified, and to know that I was kind of within striking distance of people who viewed the cross not as I had been kind of over the course of my lifetime just come to take for granted that it stood for one thing, and to know that actually within striking distance of me there were people for whom the cross symbolized what it had done for the Romans, a symbol of power. I found this very unsettling. And so when I came back from Iraq, I rewrote the introduction of my book to focus on the cross as, in a way, it's obvious it's the primal symbol of Christianity, but to try and tease what it means that the cross, its meaning has changed in this way. I wanted to put the cross at the heart of the story. And the justification for doing this is not just that the cross today is the ultimate symbol of Christianity, but that it seems to have been that right from the very beginning. And we can tell that because the cross stands at the heart of the writings of the very earliest Christian texts that we have, which are the letters written by Paul, couple of decades or so after the likeliest date for the crucifixion of Jesus. And Paul, when he writes about the cross, seems simultaneously embarrassed and triumphant. And he's embarrassed because he knows that what he has to say about the role that the cross has played in the story that he's proclaiming and the good news, the euangelion, the gospel that he's proclaiming, seems ridiculous. And yet it's the very ridiculousness of it that makes it, in Paul's opinion, so transcendently, so cosmically important. Paul knows it's an embarrassment because he is a Jew who is also very much a part of the broader Roman Mediterranean world. And so when he says that the cross is a stumbling block to the Jews and seems ridiculous, the idea of a crucified Messiah seems ridiculous to everybody else, he knows what he's talking about. He was a Pharisee. He was absolutely steeped in the heritage of Jewish scripture and teaching. And so he knows that that to tell Jews that the God of Israel in some peculiar way has come down to earth and has suffered this monstrous, appalling death is likely to seem blasphemous in the extreme. But there are further implications of this. Jews, of course, believe that the God of Israel spoke to Moses on Mount Sinai and gave them Torah, gave them prescriptions, guidance for how they were to live that was good for all time and that would serve to distinguish the children of Israel from other peoples. Paul says that with the crucifixion and the resurrection of Jesus, that has changed. That now, with the crucifixion, the law of God is for everybody. That Torah is no longer the only way to approach God, that now there is a new law, and that this law, unlike the law that had been given to Moses, written on tablets of stone, that this law is written on the heart, and that this is where people can read it. And because this is a concept that is alien to Jewish teaching, when Paul, he's writing in Greek, when he looks for a word that could explain this, he reaches for a word that was used by philosophers called the Stoics. And the Stoics had taught that the divine is manifest in the entire world and therefore manifest in human beings. And the spark of divine is what they call synodesis. It's the ability to understand what is right, what we might call conscience. And Paul reaches for this word, synodesis, to explain what he means by the law of God being written on the heart. And the implications of this for the future are absolutely momentous, because what it means is that, firstly, that if the law of God is written on the heart, then that means that humans have the ability to express what is written on the heart in human law code, in law codes that derive from human beings. So in contrast to the Jewish understanding of divine law and the understanding of divine law that Islam will inherit from the Jews, Christian civilization will have the understanding that human law codes can embody the law of God, the proper way of ordering a human society and structuring it. But on top of that, there is the implication that over the course of time, the more that the heart is illumined by the Spirit, so law progressively can be improved. And so the idea that society over the course of time can progress, the very idea that the progressive is something to be aspired towards, and this is an idea that as we've seen, in the events of recent weeks, this is something that seems to be absolutely fundamental to Western societies, the idea that society can improve and progress. This is something that goes all the way back to these revolutionary ideas that Paul is talking about in his letters, where he's trying to fashion an understanding of the law of the God of Israel that is good for every human being, not just for Jews, but for Greeks. There is no Jew or Greek, he famously says. There is no man or woman, there is no slave or free in Christ Jesus. The coming of Christ has served to dissolve these differences. The future is a universal one. And this is the applicability of Christ's sacrifice. It is for all human beings, all of whom have been created in God's image, and all of whom now are called to an equal dignity. So the origins of many of the assumptions that underpin the Western way of viewing the world at the moment, the idea that law is progressive, the idea that all human beings have a shared dignity, the idea that the moral imperatives that we can recognize in our consciences are good for people across the entire world, that there is no hierarchy of nation or race or gender or social status. All of these have their origins in, as far as we can tell, in Paul's letters and Paul's understanding of what the teachings of Christ were. But there is a further dimension to this, which is, of course, Paul's understanding that what he's preaching is going to be shocking, not just to Jews, but to the Gentiles as well, to the Greeks, and perhaps particularly to the Romans. Because what does the cross represent for Rome? For Rome, the cross represents a symbol of its power to torture to death those who stand against it. So the cross is a torture, an implement of torture that is particularly suited to rebels against Roman power in the provinces, and particularly suited to slaves. And it's particularly suited to slaves because the Romans view it as the most humiliating way to die of all. And it's humiliating because not only is it incredibly painful and protracted, but it is also very public. So your body, if you're nailed to a cross, serves as a billboard for Roman power. And those of you who have seen the film Spartacus may remember that after the defeat of Spartacus's army, the slaves are nailed to crosses all the way along the Appian Way, the great road that runs south of Rome through Italy. And it's like a kind of political advertising. It's proclaiming the fact that anyone who opposes Rome and slaves who oppose their masters are to die. And there you are, you're a lump of living meat nailed to a tree. People can watch you as the birds cluster around your eyes, pecking them out or attacking your genitals as you moan and sob, as you cry out, perhaps, "I can't breathe." You die ultimately of asphyxiation. When people hear you cry, "I can't breathe," they feel no sympathy for you. They feel no shame at the suffering being inflicted on you. They see your death as salutary, a thing of mockery and scorn and contempt. So you can see on the back of that how startling it would be for Paul and for other Christians to proclaim that, in fact, someone who had suffered this death is the Son of God, and not just any God, but the one God who has created the entire universe. And this, for Roman listeners, would have had the shock of blasphemy, because when Paul talks of the Son of God, if he puts it in Latin, he might say Divi Filius, son of a God, son of the God. That is the title of Augustus Caesar, who is the son of a god, Julius Caesar. He'd been deified. He's brought peace to the world. When he dies, he is thought to have ascended into heaven to sit at the right hand of his Father. And his cult, the cult of Augustus, is the fastest spreading cult that the world had ever seen. When Paul crosses, goes to Galatia, goes to Corinth, goes to Rome, evidence for this cult, the cult of Augustus Caesar, the son of a god, is everywhere around him. And yet Paul is preaching a parody of this, a parody in which the true son of the god is not Augustus Caesar, not the emperor, not the man who commands armies and tax collectors, but someone who had died at the hands of this empire. And so the subversive potential of this is infinite, because what it does is to bed down in the Christian imagination the idea that the slave can be greater than the master, that the victim can be greater than the victimizer, that the man who suffers can be greater than the man who tortures him. And this completely upends everything that people in antiquity, by and large, had taken for granted. And it explains what is authentically revolutionary about Christianity. Really, over the course of the decades, and then the centuries, and then the millennia that follow Paul, two aspects, more than any other, are revolutionary in the context of the world that had existed before Christianity, and are fundamental to the teachings that Christianity takes first across the Roman Empire, then beyond the limits of the empire, then in due course beyond the limits of the Atlantic itself, into the Pacific, to continents undreamed of by the Romans. And those two principles are the ones that I've talked about, that are implicit in Paul's letters. The idea that all of humanity shares in an equal dignity, that there is no Greek or Jew, and the idea that if Christ suffered the death of a slave, then perhaps slaves are closer to God's heart than the masters. In other words, an upending of the hierarchy that the Romans had taken for granted. And these are assumptions that, of course, lots of Christians fail to live by. They slaughter pagan enemies. They slaughter themselves. They take slaves. They justify all these practices in terms of Christian doctrine. And yet at the same time, kind of lurking at the back of their heads, the back of their minds, is the nagging anxiety that perhaps they are by doing this, are committing an offense against their consciences. And that's why even in the heyday of the slave trade, the Atlantic slave trade, in the heyday of European imperialism, there are those within the slave-owning societies, there are those within the imperial powers who fret and worry about what is being done. And in due course, these anxieties express themselves sufficiently as, for instance, to bring an end to slavery. The slow burn of the idea that the slave might be closer to God than the master ends up, by the 18th century, in persuading large numbers of slave owners in Britain, in the Caribbean, in North America, that it's morally unjustified. And by the 19th century, in persuading first Europe, then America, then much of the world, that the very institution of slavery is to be condemned. Likewise, over the course of European imperialism, anxieties, the moral underpinnings of imperialism, are corroded less by any notions that the colonized have than by teachings and assumptions that the colonizers themselves cherish close to themselves. The empires crumble because the imperialists come to doubt the validity of their own mission. Now, of course, in the 19th and in the 20th century, there are plenty of people in Europe who come to regard this as pusillanimity, who regard it as contemptible, who regard it as a form of weakness. And they find justification for this in teachings that really, for the first time since the conversion of the Roman Empire and then the barbarian kingdoms that succeeded to Christianity, they come to find sanction for this in teachings and ideas and notions that directly challenge Christian teaching. And really, the first great thinker to do this is Darwin. And although Darwin himself does not coin the phrase survival of the fittest, it's telling that it's coined by Darwin's own cousin. It's telling, I think, that this is the understanding, the popular understanding of what Darwin is teaching, that comes to kind of spread very rapidly. The idea that actually, in contradiction of Christian teaching, it's the strong who must prevail, and that if the strong don't prevail, then the entire stock of humanity will become weak and enfeebled. And this justifies all kinds of concepts, eugenics and so on, racial hierarchies that are profoundly inimical to Christian teaching. But the corrosive effect of Darwinism on the seeming verities of Christianity is sufficient that lots of people are able to be persuaded by what they understand as Darwinist thinking to turn their backs on the Christian teachings that all humanity are created equal, and that the weak have a particular moral hold over the strong. These come to be jettisoned by many people. At the same time, perhaps the most challenging, the philosopher who is most challengingly atheist, Friedrich Nietzsche, who regards the whole history of philosophy as a kind of mewling, sub-Christian, pathetic expression, inability to jettison Christian teachings. Nietzsche directly stares, as Paul had done, at what the cross symbolizes. And he recognizes, as Paul had done, that it is absolutely revolutionary. The Christian understanding of the cross is indeed completely revolutionary. And he says of it, to devise something which could even approach the seductive, intoxicating, anesthetizing, and corrupting power of that symbol of the Holy Cross, that horrific paradox of the crucified God, that mystery of an inconceivably ultimate, most extreme cruelty and self-crucifixion undertaken for the salvation of mankind. And it appalls Nietzsche because Nietzsche mourns the loss of confidence that Christianity has infected the strong with. He sees this as a kind of cancer, a kind of a corruption of the beauty, the power, the passion that the strong had manifested in the pre-Christian period. Nietzsche's ideal is their Achilles slaying those who are inferior to him on the battlefield of Troy. It's the strength that Caesar had taken for granted and had felt no need to apologize for. And Nietzsche mourns what Christianity has done to this and wants to see it come back. And in the decades that follow the emergence of Darwinism, the teachings of Nietzsche, these come to fuse and meld and to be misunderstood by the first regime in European history since the coming of Christianity, consciously to repudiate not just doctrinal Christianity, but the very ideals of Christianity itself. And by that, what I mean is, if you look at the French Revolution, which repudiated Christianity very powerfully, which rejected the claims of the Catholic Church, which guillotined the monarchy, which claimed to be the defender of the Church. This was not a rejection of Christian doctrines, quite the opposite. In many ways, it was a great flaring up, a great illustration of the power of Christianity to inspire revolutionary force. The French Revolution was predicated on the teaching of Christ that the first shall be last and the last shall be first. It was predicated on the idea that there is a common humanity. These are the ideals of the revolution. It's predicated on the idea that the sans-culotte has a moral quality that is greater than that of a king or a bishop. And so likewise, the Russian Revolution, even though it was even more militant in its hostility to doctrinal Christianity, to doctrinal religion, was founded on those ideals even more militantly. But the Nazis did not, as the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution had done, uphold these doctrines of Christianity. the Nazis did not believe that that the weak have a moral purchase on the strong. The Nazis believed that the strong had not just the right, but a duty to crush and perhaps to kill the weak. And of course, the Nazis did not believe, as Paul had done, that there is no Jew or Greek. The Nazis absolutely believed that the differences between Jew and Greek were fundamental. And Hitler himself, he believed that the Greeks, that the Romans in their heyday had come from Nordic stock. Hitler identified closely with Augustus, Divi Filius, the son of God, the son of Julius Caesar. And for that reason, he regarded Paul as the embodiment of everything that he most detested, because he believed that Paul's teachings were the embodiment of the Jews' resentment of the power and the strength and the glory of the Nordic stock of Greece and Rome, and that Paul's teachings were designed to corrupt and destroy this sense of strength, and that therefore Christianity was the most lethal blow that had ever been struck against the Nordic race, and that Christian teachings had, like a cancer, spread through a race that properly should be contemptuous of other races and should properly be scornful of the weak and the feeble and the imbecilic. And so we see in this perhaps the most grotesque paradox in the entire history of Christianity, and there's a sense in which the entire history of Christianity is all about paradox. The most grotesque paradox is that Hitler ends up targeting the Jews because he blames them for Christianity. And when he does that, he is able, of course, to draw on many, many centuries of Christian hostility to the Jews. And when, in the wake of the end of the Second World War, the wake of the Holocaust, this has a devastating effect on the moral status of Christianity. In the 60s, institutional Christianity in Europe, certainly, the practice of church going pretty much falls off a cliff. But the reason for that, I think, is not that Europeans are rejecting their Christian heritage. It's just that that heritage has come to take on a new form. Because whereas before the Nazis, everyone pretty much, even if they were militant atheists, would look to the figure of Jesus as the kind of moral lodestar. They would say, what would Jesus do? After the Second World War, after the Nazis, that was no longer really the case. Now, people in the West, when they wanted to know what they should do, they would ask, what would Hitler do? And then they would do the opposite. And in a sense, there was no longer any need for the fabric of Christianity, the framework of belief that it had provided, because history had provided Christian Europe with a new panoply of a new understanding of good and evil, one that was enshrined the Nazis as the devil, Nazism as the quintessence of evil, Hitler as the new model of Satan. And in a sense, that is that's where we are now. Of course, there are lots of believing Christians still across Europe, across America, but there's a sense in which the commanding heights of Western culture have been ceded by believing Christians, but have been taken up by people who believe in Christian values, believe in Christian assumptions just as profoundly as confessional Christians, but can do so because they can look to the Nazis for a kind of distorted reflection of what Christianity is. You look to the Nazis and you know that they are evil because our understanding of what is evil remains a deeply Christian one, and our understanding of what is good remains a deeply Christian one. And so that's why, where do our ideas come from? That's why I 45 minutes, I really only skimmed the surface of it. But I hope that to a degree, I have made the case for the fact that even now, in a seemingly post-Christian world, our ideas, our assumptions, our beliefs, our values are nothing if not Christian. And without Christianity, what we believe in, what we take for granted, would be unfathomably different, so different that it's almost impossible to comprehend what we might believe in. So thank you very much. Did that work? Did you all manage to hear me? Thank you. And can I just check you all managed to hear me? Because you could all hear me. Because I was just sitting here speaking to myself, and I was worried that perhaps I just talking to myself. It's a bit odd. Well, in a good way, I hope. Goodness, that's well. I'm not sure, because I think it would be a very foolish person who made any prophecies about the future at the moment. Um, one of the things that's been interesting, I was writing the book over a period of quite convulsive change. So Brexit and Trump and COVID and all kinds of things have happened over the course while I was writing it. So I'm hesitant to make any prophecies. But what I would say is that I think that really there are three possible roads that the West might end up taking. The first is that it will remain on what you might call a broadly secular, liberal, progressive course. The fact that progressive secular liberalism has emerged from Christianity, in a sense, is just a historical detail. It's Christianity perhaps was like the rocket booster that is needed to blast off and to get through the atmosphere. And then it disconnects, and secular liberal humanism will continue to power its way through space and time under its own power, under its own velocity. It doesn't need Christianity anymore. So that's perhaps that's one path if that turns out to be the case. The second option is that as Christianity fades, if it fades, so Nietzsche's prophecy will come to be true, because Nietzsche, essentially, the challenge that Nietzsche throws down to secular agnostics or atheists is to say that you can't really have Christian values and ethics if you don't have Christian belief. And the fact that people still essentially believe Christian fundamentals without necessarily having been schooled in Christian belief is delusory, because the corpse of God is so massive that it's going to take a very, very long time to rot. But it will rot, and in due course, perhaps, we will see a reprise of pre-Christian ideas that privilege the strong, that privilege the beautiful, that privilege the idea that certain groups of people have a kind of authority over other groups of people. And so, in a sense, perhaps the future is a kind of soft fascism. So that's perhaps another option. The third option is that as the tide of Western power and authority retreats, so people in the West will come to realize that what they have thought is are universal values, are not universal at all. That just because we in the West believe in certain things doesn't mean that everyone else across the world is going to believe them. And that therefore, if we want to uphold what we see as our distinctive values, we're going to have to recognize that they have a distinctive source. And it seems to me indisputable that that distinctive source is Christianity, and that many of the things that we believe, in fact, are not givens, but are theological. And therefore to believe in them requires a kind of conscious leap of faith. And if you can believe in the existence of universal human rights, then perhaps it's not such a great leap to go back to believing in the fact that Jesus rose from the dead, and that this is what sustains the idea ultimately of human rights. So perhaps the third option is that the West re-Christianizes. So, and it'll probably be an element of all three of those. You'll get kind of different pockets, different emphasis amongst different places, different groups of people. But I wouldn't like to say absolutely which of those is the likeliest. But I think it'll be a fusion or an option of some of those. One of those three courses is likely to become the most prevalent, but I don't know which one.
Yes, please. First, say hello from Kristiansand.
Hello.
Hi. Hi. Hi.
First question here is from me. So, given what you've said and what you just answered, if it is true that these values that we hold so high is connected directly to Christianity, how do you see, as a non-Christian, what ought non-Christians to do then? Should they rebel against these Christianized values, or should they embrace them? And if so, why?
Well, I think that what is destabilizing for many liberals at the moment is the realization that ultimately there's nothing to stop people from rejecting the idea of human rights, or upholding kind of racist ideas, or trampling on everything that liberals take for granted, because if there's nothing scientific about these. There's nothing necessarily self-evident about them. So to believe in them requires faith. Now, this is a kind of unsettling realization for people, and it's one that I think people are reluctant to accept. And so one of the things I think has been happening over the past few years is that the traditional response to people who challenge liberal values is to say, oh, you're Hitler, or you're a Nazi, or you're a fascist, or you're a racist. I think the impact of that is starting to fade. And I think quite a lot of what's happening in America at the moment, and to a lesser extent in European countries as well, that there's a quality of shrillness to the insistence on, to the language of anti-racists. The insistence that if you don't accept what anti-racists are saying, then you must be cancelled, you must be rejected. If you don't accept the tenets of Black Lives Matter, then you're worse than filth. And I think that is expressive of the fact that the language of faith and the kind of shared language that back in the 50s and 60s, when the civil rights movement exploded in the United States, that's been lost. So if you think about the symbolism of taking the knee, which has kind of spread the world, spread across the world. That's something that Martin Luther King did. And when Martin Luther King kneeled, he knew as a Christian minister that you kneel before God. You kneel because you are a sinner and you are kneeling before him for that reason. And he knew as well that this was something that went all the way, but he was a Baptist minister, that Baptists have been doing this as an expression of their opposition to the slave trade, going back all the way to the 18th century. So taking the knee has, in the 60s, was rooted both in Christian theology and in the distinctive history of Christian Protestant abolitionism. Today, when people take the knee, they're doing it because a highly well-paid sports star did it in a sport that most people in Europe don't understand. And so it has much, much less resonance for people. And so therefore it's capable, of course, of inspiring, lots of people are doing it all over the place, but equally it can inspire a degree of kickback that I think Martin Luther King's gesture did not. And so I think that that's why we have a kind of more, the situation is much more polarized than it was. Martin Luther King was all about reaching out to white Protestants, to white Christians, and saying, you are our brothers, you are our sisters, treat us as your brothers and sisters. That language is no longer there, I think, in the same way. And personally, I think that that's a loss, because I think that ultimately the idea that all human beings are created equal, it is a theological one, because that is the source of the idea that all humans have a dignity. If we're created in the image of an all-powerful, all-good creator, then that gives us an incredible dignity. But you have to believe in the existence of an all-powerful, all-good creator to be able to believe that. And if you don't believe that, then it becomes harder. And I think that the kind of the tensions, the bitterness, the anger, the polarization that is afflicting Western society at the moment is an expression of that.
We can hold the question if it's okay.
Yes. How has your views on Christianity changed after writing your book about the Dominion one?
I felt when I began it that I was embarking on a pilgrimage. I wasn't entirely certain where I was going to end up. I wasn't entirely certain what the route was going to be. I wasn't even certain whether I would get to my journey's end. I'm hugely relieved that I did, but it made it kind of it made it kind of exciting, and it gave it a spiritual dimension in a way that nothing else I've ever done has done. And I found the experience of meditating on the Bible, on the Hebrew prophets in particular, on the Exodus narrative, on the Gospels, of course, and on Paul's letters and the book of Job, on those texts in particular, profoundly challenging, moving, inspiring, and then to move through history and to immerse myself in the engagement of different people in different times, in different places, with this great inheritance of Christian faith and literature and teaching. I found it incredibly powerful and eye-opening. And as I say, it sharpened for me the understanding that I'd already come to, that to hold the liberal beliefs that I have is in itself a kind of, a form of faith, and yet how pallid and anemic my liberal humanism seemed compared to the richness of the Christian inheritance. And it didn't really matter what stage of Christianity it was, whether I was looking at the writings of the church fathers or Augustine or the teachings of medieval saints or Protestant reformers or the Quakers. I found them all incredibly powerful. And in fact, the very fact that the understanding of Christianity had evolved so powerfully that it was capable of so many different forms was itself part of what I found moving. And at the end of the book, I quote Tolkien, who loved myth, who did not regard myth as in any way pejorative, thought that a myth could be true. And I guess that's where I've come to. I believe in Christianity as a myth. If I'm going to believe in the things that I believe, I'd rather believe in them with everything that Christianity brings. That incredible weight of tradition, of teaching, the understanding of the Spirit, the way in which Pentecostal fire can change the world. And so I see myself as a kind of an open hearth waiting for the Pentecostal fire to light the kindling that is there waiting to be lit. I guess that's the effect that writing Dominion has had on me. Sure, 2 more questions. That would be great. Yeah, if I'm not keeping you from your meal, which.
Hi. I have a question because I heard you, Holland, speaking of Nietzsche before, and then you talked about the big rotting corpse of God. And I was wondering, for you personally, you talked about this myth, which is holding you on the end with something to grasp on. But it seems to me that you see both the dagger, the blood, and the corpse. So you know the consequences of denying the all existing omnipotent God on the one hand and the atheism on the other side. So in all honesty, I'm wondering of how you personally can choose the myth when you know it's a fable, so to speak.
Because I think that there are many ways to relate to the inheritance of Christianity, and I think because the story in Acts of Paul's conversion is so influential. It's not even a conversion; it's the wrong word. But the idea that that faith will come from Christ speaking from a golden light as you fall from your horse on the way to Damascus. I realized that this has been so influential on my understanding of how one becomes a Christian that in a way it's kept me from engaging in any form of Christian faith for years and years. But what I've realized now, or maybe realize is the wrong word, what I've come to think is of course that there are many ways, and that in a sense I'm following my own path, perhaps. And as I say, it's a pilgrimage. And although with Dominion I've reached Journey's End, with the broader pilgrimage that I feel myself to be on, I have not yet arrived at the journey's end, but I feel myself to be on the road. And the road that I'm on is a road in which, as I say, myth is not a negative. And the odd thing is, that I'm sure it's the same in Norway as it is in England, that the public expressions of the church and of believers in the public space about Christianity, people certainly here try to make basically Christianity seem like a kind of something that's secular, and they can do this very easily because the idea of the secular, as I haven't got time to explain why, but it's in the book. The idea of the secular is a fundamentally Christian one. So it's very easy for Christians talking about Christianity to make Christianity just seem a variant on the secular, because, in a sense, the secular is simply a variant on Christianity. But I think that is a profound mistake, personally, because actually, if I'm going to become Christian, I don't want something that is just a variant on the liberal, progressive, secular humanism that I get anyway. I want it to be incredibly weird. I want the angels. I want the demons. I want the fantastical stories that you get in the Bible. I want the Bible to be, far more true than lots of Christians seem willing to accept. And when I was writing one of the penultimate chapters in Dominion about Africa, one of the things I found incredibly powerful was how in Africa, the Bible doesn't seem, the stuff about angels and demons doesn't seem an embarrassment. It seems vividly true in a way that it had done to people in the early Middle Ages, to missionaries coming to the land of the Vikings or whatever. You could believe in angels, you could believe in demons, and so oddly, I feel that the fact that the mythic qualities of it, the angels and all that kind of stuff, that actually matters. It seems to me important that that's the way that I come to it, because in a way, if I can't have angels, then what's the point? I don't know whether that makes sense, but the miraculous, the extraordinary, the weird, the strange, for me, has to be a part of it. Hi. It's there in the chapter on the Nazis in Dominion. The way that Hitler understood it, I think it's because you have to understand. I think it's so hard for us to understand that the Nazis thought that what they were doing was right, and so you have to try and work out why were the Nazis doing what they were doing. We kind of think, well, they were doing it because they were evil. But they weren't. They thought that what they were doing was right. And it's kind of rooted in this kind of bastard Darwinism, this bastard Nietzscheanism, this idea that to succor the weak is to enfeeble the stock of the human race. And that history is about a great carnivorous struggle between different races. And Hitler correctly saw Christianity as the great bane. Nietzsche has the famous phrase about the blonde beast, that the blonde beast ends up in a monastery, gelded, self-hating, self-loathing. I mean, there's a couple of quotes I've got here, which come from various SS magazines, which the first one directly targets the Christian idea that all human beings are created equally in the image of God. So it's a question, and the SS and Himmler were particularly ideologically opposed to Christianity. Himmler drew up a program that would have seen, if the Nazis had won the war, that would have seen Christianity targeted for destruction over a 40-year period. And this question says, can we still tolerate our children being obliged to learn that Jews and Negroes, just like Germans or Romans, are descended from Adam and Eve simply because a Jewish myth says so? And the answer that it's a rhetorical question. The answer is the SS are expecting is no. And then another one, harping on and on that God died on the cross out of pity for the weak, the sick, and the sinners. They then demand that the genetically diseased be kept alive in the name of a doctrine of pity that goes against nature and of a misconceived notion of humanity. So the Nazis saw themselves as going with the grain of nature, and that misconceived notion of humanity. They felt that you've got to be cruel to be kind, that if you allow the sick and the disabled and the feeble to live, then in the long run that will be deleterious for the prospects of humanity, and specifically for the prospects of the Germanic race, and therefore it's a kindness to dispose of them. And that's it's a kind of hideous challenge, I think, because those challenges now lurk on the margins of post-Christian Europe. It's kind of like Grendel out in the wilds, waiting to burst into our mead hall. Okay, one more. Sure.
Thank you. Thanks. Hi. Thank you for a great talk, Tom. I have a question about the concept of rights, because I was a bit surprised when you said that the ideas of the French Revolution and also the Russian Revolution basically were Christian, and I wonder, is it possible to have the idea of rights in kind of Hobbesian terms, where rights is something we have against each other, but still violate the idea of the human dignity that is the fundamental Christian idea? And would you say, as an historian, that the concept of rights that we talk so much about this time is that a term that is relevant for the early Christian, in the concept of rights in political sense?
Well, the concept of rights absolutely is not there in the Bible or in early Christian teachings, and it emerges from a kind of a very distinct context, which is that of this great revolutionary movement that happens in the 11th century, when the papacy basically kind of institutes all kinds of revolutionary movements that will replicate and reappear over the course of subsequent Western history. And one of the movements is a desire to provide a framework of law that Christians across the whole of Europe can appeal to over the heads of kings and emperors. And to do that, obviously, they have to construct a framework of law. And whether by coincidence or not, it's around this time that the great corpus of Justinianic law is found in Bologna. And Bologna then becomes the center for the study of this. And it attracts people increasingly from across Europe. And this is the foundation of what will become the university system. And other universities, Paris, Oxford, follow quite quickly. And the idea, the study of law is there right absolutely from the beginning. In a sense, it's the genesis for the entire university system. But Justinianic law, the Roman law, is of course, it's of human origin. It derives from emperors, some of whom aren't even Christian, and so people who are looking to provide a divinely sanctioned law for Christians in the 12th century start to construct a framework of law from the various canons, which are the decrees of popes, of church councils, teachings of the church fathers, and so on. And what they find is that lots of these canons contradict each other. And so it's quite difficult to construct a kind of coherent framework. But that doesn't put them off. They embark on this huge project, but they realize that they need certain kind of core fundamentals to explain and justify how they're going to rationalize and sift all these various canons. And so that causes them to look at certain assumptions through in a distinctive way. And one of the assumptions that they look at in a distinctive way is the idea that the rich have a duty of charity to the poor. And the canon lawyers turn this on its head, and they say, well, if the rich have a duty to give charity to the poor, then that must mean that the poor have a right to what the rich are giving them, which in turn must mean that the poor have a right to food, to shelter, to clothing. And this is a really revolutionary idea. And as with so much in Christianity, it's not that, it's not like you get the Ten Commandments or something. It's not that you get the American Constitution or the Bill of Rights or anything like that. It's kind of like lighting a depth charge, and it fuses away, and every so often you get explosions, and it will go off on a new path. And that's really the idea of human rights emerges from Christian theology. It emerges from close reading of the Bible, from the church fathers, of the canons, of all this great inheritance of Christian teaching. But it goes off in a kind of fizzing, radically new way. And so it's there when Las Casas is defending the rights of the Native Americans against the idea that they are natural slaves, against the Aristotelian doctrine that there are natural slaves. He invokes this idea of rights. And of course, it's there when the French revolutionaries construct their idea of rights. French Revolution is taking place in a Catholic country, and so it has this inheritance of canon law to draw upon. And it's there when, in the heyday of Western influence after the Second World War, the United Nations draws up its charter, and the language of rights is written into the charter. But the reason that the language of rights is written into the charter isn't because the language of rights is universal. It's because Western power at that time is so hegemonic that all the various Western lawyers who are drawing it up just take for granted that it's there. But you see now with the rise of China to superpower status, that actually this idea of rights is a very distinctively Western one. It's not one that is there in Chinese history. And so I think that it's precisely the fact that, and also the role that rights has in Islam. There is no concept of rights because everything that is right comes from God. And so likewise in the Islamic world, you see there's a kind of immense anxiety about what the United Nations Charter embodies. And I think that the more that Western power retreats, the more this is going to become evident. And therefore, the more incumbent it will be upon people in the West who want to believe in things like rights to find some justification for them. And of course, philosophers have a role to play in that. But I think ultimately, the surest basis for it is the Christian one, because it's Christian faith that generated them in the first place.
Thank you.
Thank you. COVID willing. Thank you very, very much for having me. Really enjoyed it. And enjoy your meal and your philosophy. How brilliantly Socratic. Thank you. And you.